Have you ever felt your organization could achieve better results if they just faced problems differently? If so, this interview is for you. Randy Salzman shares some background about thinking through and addressing problems more comprehensively, or design thinking, and how to help your organization shift to that approach. He's co-author of Design Thinking for the Greater Good, Innovation in the Social Sector, which covers this topic in more detail.
Welcome to the Social Good Instigators Podcast, where your host, Kirsten Bullock, interviews leaders of social entrepreneurship ventures who share what's working. Please add the podcast to your favorite RSS feed or iTunes. Now, let's get on with the show.
Hi, thanks so much, Salz, for joining me today.
Oh, glad to be here. Thank you for asking me.
You're welcome. So a couple of interesting things I've learned about Salz. He's a communications and creativity professor. He does consulting and teaching in design thinking and empathy, and he's a co-author of Design Thinking for the Greater Good, Innovation in the Social Sector that's due out this month, September. You can read his full bio on the podcast page at socialgoodinstigators.net. So, Salz, before we really jump into things, could you provide a brief overview for our listeners of what design thinking is and how it might be different from what a lot of organizations are doing?
Well, most organizations are living pretty much with an analytical approach to data and information, and have been for, 50 years perhaps. And it's been very successful for them. So therefore, most managers have grown up in that analytical approach. But now we're finally realizing that the solutions are not inside a silo. They're at the margins of the silos. So if I'm an engineer, I'm a civil engineer, I might have a hard time talking to an electrical engineer, and even a harder time talking to a behavioralist. But if I can break through that barrier of my silo and their silos, then I'll be able to come up with creative ideas that address, not necessarily solve, that address the truly wicked problems that nonprofits and governmental issues are dealing with. Now, so my shorthand way of calling design thinking is it's a problem-solving process which explores deeply, empathizes continually, ideates rapidly, prototypes simply, and iterates constantly. In effect, what we're doing, or what I suggest that design thinking is that we go back to the way we actually dealt with the world when we were young and when the world was young, and dealt with a real problem in a way that we can really solve it because we try something and we see if it works. We adapt it and we make it better, as opposed to trying to come up with the answer prior to even beginning the solution.
Great. Now, let's go back to the beginning when you said addressing wicked problems, because I know we had a guest on the show early on who defined wicked problems for us, but could you define what that is for listeners who may not be familiar?
To me, and I think to most people who think about this, a wicked problem is a problem where once you come up with a solution, you have to redefine the problem. That the question is so massive that any idea that you bring forward to solve it requires a reevaluation of the question. And it's wicked because there are so many different areas that begin to take place. Others, I think, will refer to a wicked problem as being human behavior. And I think those are kind of the same concept. There's the great quote that human behavior is not rocket science. It's much, much, much harder than that, which kind of describes who we are as a people. And we as human beings, which of course every problem is human related, we as human beings, we're all screwed up because we're human beings. And that's both a plus and a minus. The traditional analytics, what they is this presumption that there's a rational consumer out there. And it's a good way to plan. It's a numerical way to plan. But the problem is the rational consumer doesn't really exist. We all have rules of thumb about how we survive life. And those rules of thumb, whether or not we know they are happening, are based in our very early experiences and the things that we learned before we even knew we were learning. And we can't get out of that rationality that we grew up with. When rationality, our rationality may or may not be connected to anything real. It's just the way we see the world. Howard Gardner, the Harvard psychologist, talks about this as the engravings on our brains. And we bring those with us no matter who we are and no matter what we believe. It's very hard to cognitively overcome those engravings on our brains. If we grow up in, say, a scientific field or a behavioral field, we more and more think that's the only way to look at the world. And coming up to be an adult and finding out that the ideas, the nonprofit that you're working for, the government the problem that you're trying to address, what you're doing isn't quite working. It makes you hunker down and more believe that you're doing the right thing, as opposed to step back and say, okay, we're doing the right thing as per our procedures, but it's not actually addressing the problem that we're trying to deal. So that's the wicked problem.
Mm-hmm.
It's what you've been told to do, but you can see that it's not quite really nailing the issue. So can you then pull yourself back and look at the bigger picture and adjust your understanding of the question so that you can come up with a solution that actually addresses the challenge that you're facing? Very hard. It's not easy.
Right. And even if you can do that as an individual, then trying to shift a whole organization to see it that way, I would imagine those analytical approaches would also get in the way of implementing change in the direction of an organization.
Yeah. Well, managers get to be managers by mastering the existing system. Okay. So the first thing that the innovator, that the design thinker does, is he or she looks at his boss and his or her coworkers, and they're people who have mastered the system. And you're going to say, oh, God, we've got to change the way we look at the problem. So two things happen. One is, if I am not the innovator, then I have to say, oh, my God, the system that I've grown up with and I've become very successful in, it's not the right one. Ooh, and that is terrible. The second thing I have to do is find the time to listen to the innovator, to listen to that person who has a new idea, who wants to convince me that the system that I'm in isn't quite doing what we want to do. And so I will tend to back burner that innovator. Yeah, I want to read your little idea here, but I just don't have the time. And I'll back burner it. Now, that's very common. That's typical human nature. That's not anything evil. And so the innovator, the design thinker, has got to come up with a way to address that. And so what our book is, Design Thinking for the Greater Good, Innovation in the Social Sector, is the subtitle. Design Thinking for the Greater Good, or D4GG, as we say. It takes 10 stories and how people have successfully managed that issue and several other issues to bring forward new ideas and get them implemented by a company, well, by a nonprofit, by a government in this particular case. Corporations have been doing this for a little bit longer than nonprofits have. But we think because of the wonderfulness of the people who want to help society, the social workers, the nonprofits, the brilliance of their desire to help, that design thinking has much more power in the social nonprofit sector than it does in the commercial sector. Simply because you don't go into the social work, you don't go into nonprofits to make money, you go into there to help society. So we think that the nonprofits and the governments people are already predisposed to truly want to help. But They have the same bureaucratic issues that everybody does. And we're seeing that across the world there are governments and there are nonprofits and even governmental large bureaucracies like Health and Human Services in the United States and the Veterans Administration, which are working very hard to get out of the bureaucratic stranglehold that you're kind of referring to there, Kirsten. And coming up with wonderful approaches for importing design thinking to produce better outcomes. And if you want, I can tell you a couple stories. But
yeah, we'd love
if
to.
You want that or not.
I'd love to hear us.
Pardon?
If there's one case study or story from the book that really stands out for you as far as an organization that went through this process, what kind of barriers they ran into, and how they pulled out on the other side. I think a lot of times those can be really instructive.
Well, the stories are, in effect, the soul of data, as somebody from Atlanta once put it, or just recently put it anyway. And so the stories really do tell us how we can address the quantitative statistics, which we often use to start our discussion. If you start the discussion from empathizing deeply and exploring the real humans, what you find is there's so many unarticulated needs out there that I don't even know that I need this. But then if you do really good ethnography, you've discovered that, oh, yes, you do need this, whatever this is.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the best example is Procter & Gamble's Swiffer, where no of the floor moppers said, well, we need a throwaway mop. What they said was, oh, I spend so much time cleaning the mop, i.e., and the researchers, the ethnographers, watched them clean the mop for almost half the time they're cleaning the floor. There was no value for them to clean the mop. The value was in the clean floor. But they were spending that much time. And the ethnographers said, okay, well, you don't even talk about this, but what you really want is a way to solve the cleaning of the mop. And so they invented the Swiffer, which is just you throw the pad in the washing machine and it cleans it for you while you're doing the rest of your wash. Mm-hmm. So you don't have to clean them up. Well, that's kind of the epitome of how ethnography and observation can find that unarticulated need.
Right.
But
and the design thinker can come to the point where, yeah, you need a new mop. Whereas I'm looking at this as trying to distinguish between the two styles of thinking. The other might just look at it and say, okay, we need to find a quicker way to clean them up, rather than thinking outside the box and just coming up with a way to have disposable mops.
Well, how to solve the real problem as opposed to just adapting to something that we're trying to sell.
Do you have an example? Right. Do you have an example of that maybe from the nonprofit sector? Something that you ran into?
Well, the story that I like to tell is the Community Transportation Association of America. They're now doing this every year, but 4 or 5 years ago when they first started, they got 7 small teams from 7 communities around America. And their concept, their problem was to help the low-paid worker get to the low-paying jobs. Seems pretty simple. It was a transportation issue. And a team out of what they call the Coastal Bend area, which is down near Corpus Christi in Texas, Coastal Bend of Texas, they were going along, and their problem is that the low-paying workers all lived in the rural areas, and there was only one city, Corpus Christi, Texas. Primarily, it was an hour, 2 hours away by car or bus, and it was so infrequent. There was no bus service, there was no transit service. So everybody got to work, if they got to work, in informal carpools. And in cars that often were not very reliable. So that was their challenge. And they set out and they couldn't come up with ideas and they couldn't come up with concepts. They did a lot of ethnography to understand the issue. And then one day they just kind of said, do we really have to take low-paying workers to low-paying jobs with this small grant that the Community Transportation Association did? And they pivoted to this wonderful, creative idea. One member of the team was from Del Mar College, which is a small community college in Corpus Christi. And they said, well, we've got this public service academy where we try to train people to be police officers and firemen and EMT drivers and things like that, but we're kind of undersubscribed. And somebody else said, well, my fire chief has got some spend down money. Spend down money being that money that's kind of left over at the end of the budget.
Mm-hmm.
And what they did was they picked up some kids at the high school and started taking them, 15, 16, 17-year-olds, 18-year-olds, and taking them to the academy for future jobs, not present jobs. And they did a brilliant job of communicating this. The fire chief was patted on the back for being farsighted because he was providing money for helping these kids see a better future. Okay, and they would take them there, and the kids got excited about rappelling down buildings and taking fingerprints and putting on masks, and they visualized that in many ways, including video and including cameras, and they promoted that. And then they had the very first year, they had a graduation award for the kids that went to, and they produced that really big and kept promoting it with the idea of we're going to work our way back around to taking low-paying workers to low-paying jobs in Corpus Christi by having these buses that pick up at a high school and deliver to Del Mar College, and then they expanded on both ends. And then from that success, that small success, they built more fire chiefs wanting to be involved, more police chiefs wanting to be involved, coming up with small monies to help. And then the Texas Department of Transportation coming up with a little bit more money to help. And then Uncle Sam coming up with more money to help. And now they have a regular commute bus that goes from a variety of small high schools to the college and to 3 or 4 other low-paying job places, so that it's going on a daily basis. So they wonderfully adapt their whole question to a brand new idea. And then they build, because they got the big picture in mind. We're taking the low-income workers to the low-paying jobs and helping them solve this really horrible transportation problem. But how can we use society? How can we address the real world to help people help this problem? And to me, it's just a wonderful story of the community transportation being willing to bend, not being bureaucracy driven. It's a wonderful story of the diversity of ideas. The people on the team were not all the same types of folks. They were from the Chamber of Commerce. They were from the college. They were from the transportation field. They were from the high schools. And they merged all of the silos into a whole new way of thinking to come up with an idea that is, I think, brilliant.
And you say that one sentence like it just happened. You snapped your fingers, or they snapped their fingers and it just happened. I imagine it was messy in the middle of it.
Oh,
Were you privy to any of those background things that happened?
Oh, yeah. Well, the kind of the key point is you immerse yourself in the problem and don't. If you go to a public hearing, which certainly you did as a nonprofit person, you go to the public hearing and you've got your 3 minutes or 5 minutes or whatever it is you're supposed to speak, and then there's somebody after you and somebody before you, and you go up and do your 3 to 4 minutes or 5 minutes or whatever, and you read your little speech or you go through your talking points. And then you sit down, and then somebody else does the same thing. Somebody else. There's really no communication between you and that somebody else. What this process does is by putting all of these ideas, all of these people, all of this diversity in the room however you define that. You put them in the room, and then you develop a conversation, you develop a dialogue that causes you to see opportunities at the margins that you didn't want to see. Now, in this particular case, the Coastal Bend team, they were literally in the middle of a webinar. And somebody said, "Oops, let's shut up." And they closed off the webinar.
Broke into design thinking.
and broke into design thinking, yes. And that's where they came up with this idea. And when they went forward with it, like we always suggest, they forward 3 or 4 napkin pitches. I forget the number. And a napkin pitch is the idea and why you think it'll work. And this was only one of the napkin pitches. And what sold the powers that be on the idea was the enthusiasm of the kids. That they were looking for something to do as opposed to sit around the house and play video games all summer or watch TV all summer. There was something they could do that sounded like it might be fun. It would at least be different. And the kids got excited about it. And the powers that be, the money, they go, "Oh my God, yeah, I don't want my kids sitting around playing video games all day. So why would I want the low income folks' kids sitting around playing video games?" And then they used it, and they consistently built on helping people do the right thing from that point. So the Coastal Bend team all 7 teams did something that was very exciting and interesting, but that was the one that pivoted entirely away from the challenge, never losing sight of the big picture, and working with what was available to cause something to happen that has turned into, I think, a good way to address all the issues. And the key point is upper management, the Community Transportation Association in this particular case, didn't send down from the mountaintop the answer. What it did is provide the parameters for the locals, however that is defined, to come up with an answer themselves that matched the statistics, the desires, the inputs, the soul of the data that they could find. And then they can perhaps take that and transfer it to another community, but that other community's got to bring its own issues, its own data, its own, to use that adaption.
Right. So that's an instance where things worked well. What do you see as the biggest mistake? Let's say there's one, we'll call them the renegade or the instigator in the organization, and they decide that, we really need to start looking at this. What's the most common mistake that you see when that initial person starts pushing forward on this?
Because I have been one myself, which we actually call them Jeffries, and I personally talk about it as a flake. I'm a flake. I'm a Jeffrey. I'm an instigator. And what happens with me is I've got this idea, and I can't get anybody to listen, so I get frustrated, and then I get angry. And then I change jobs. That happens an awful lot. What I think that the instigators, the flakes, the Jeffries need to do is to recognize the value of the other side of it, the button-down analytical types, the Georges, as we call them, what they bring to the page. I used to call them bean counters. Right? And then I get angry. Those bean counters refuse to see something that's so obvious to me. Right? And what I was doing was I was not recognizing the value that they bring. And what we do in design thinking is we call it the front half and the back half. The front half is the realm of the Jeffries, and the back half is the realm of the Georges. The Georges, the button-down analytical types, will take the instigators' ideas and say, well, you're making some assumptions here. Let's figure out if we can test the assumptions. Let's do the analytics right now. But on your assumptions about why this is a great idea. And what you discover in design thinking is if you got to call the baby ugly, which is really hard to do for those instigators, us Jeffrey types, if you got to call the baby ugly, when the Georges, when the bean counters, when they come up with okay, we're going to test the assumptions, we, the instigators, see whether or not our idea will work. And that is the hardest thing for a Jeffrey to do. If you have a great idea, and yes, it is always a great idea, but maybe it won't work in the real world at this particular moment. Maybe it won't. And when you do the assumption testing, what happens is you see it. They don't bring it to you. The hard part for the Georges, the button-down analytical types, is to hold off on their skepticism until you explore the idea, to put the possibilities before the constraints. And the design thinking methodology, the 4-question methodology, Gene Lidke and Tim Ogilvy's, the what is, what if, what works, what wows and what works. The what is and what if, that's the area of the instigators. Okay, let's come up with these great ideas. And then the what wows and what works are the areas of the Georges, the button-down analytical types. And what you see happens is this diversity of thinking becomes a power in itself, which usually is people just kind of crossing their arms and mumbling about the others. So the design thinking methodology takes you past that issue and problem and brings you to being a team. And it becomes immensely successful. The Coastal Bend story that I talked about, they had a designated skeptic, as they called them. And at first, they would say the designated skeptic always stepped on the idea before. But then they become to realize is that if they got her, and it was a her in that particular case, to sit back and not say anything while they went crazy on the ideas, that when she brought in the thinking, the analytical thinking, that's when they figured out a way to get around all of the problems that she was aware of, not that allowed her skepticism to stop the thinking. So they did the possibilities first, and they come up with this bizarre possibility, which seems to have nothing to do with taking low-income workers to low-paying jobs. It's taking high school kids to a service academy. Wow, that's no connection. And when they start dealing with her objections, that's when they really get creative and excited and fun, because they found, or at least the way they talk about it, they found themselves laughing at how they could use the system to be innovative in a very under the surface way to I can't even think of the term right now, but to be subversive in a way that actually helps what the system really wants to do. And so, so they had more fun with it than fighting with each other.
Right, and making the most of those differing ways to approach the program, the problem.
The Civil War General Bedford Forrest, who was actually kind of a slime ball, but General Nathan Bedford Forrest, he had this wonderful quote that you get there firstest with the mostest. And that's what these folks basically did. They had to figure out where there was, and then they have to figure out how they get all of these different, from all different directions, these different ideas, these different silos to get there at the same time. Firstest with the mostest. So I always say, quotes are kind of what show the world the soul of what's going on and how we can make things actually happen. So I use a lot of quotes, and I think most design thinkers do use a lot of quotes. The most famous is probably Edison's, that there's no such thing as a new idea. There are only new applications of old ideas. And that's exactly, of course, you know this, we use a lot of analogies. One of our trigger questions in brainstorming and the design thinking for the greater good is that we use the quote, or the question being, pick an organization and talk about what they are doing, like, say, the NFL, a professional basketball team, the U.S. military, something. Pick an organization and apply what it is doing to your particular challenge. And try to figure out how they would address this particular challenge. Let's find the analogy. A real good example of that is that when a plane is taking off or landing, no one in the cockpit or on the radio can say anything that doesn't have something to do with taking off or landing. You can't mention the fact that there's a baby crying in the back. Okay, there's nothing like that happens. Mm-hmm. And one hospital, Monash in Australia, they said they adapted that analogy, and they said, okay, well, when a nurse is dispensing medicine, no one can talk to her, and so the nurse now puts on almost like a jacket that tells every other staff member that she or he is dispensing medicine, so they don't get distracted, because that was a big issue causing problems, and a simple distraction,
right.
And you
and
forget whether you put
problem.
Yeah, and so but they had adapted that analogy from planes, landing and picking up planes. Now most people wouldn't know about that, but it just so happens that the diversity of thinking in their disruption by design team, I think is what they call it, is that somebody was a pilot and said, this is kind of what we always make sure we do. Bingo. Mm-hmm. How do you adapt that to eliminate as many disruptions as you possibly can, distractions as you possibly can? And they did. And, I don't remember the data on that, but they've had a lot. They are, Monash in Australia is very excited about design thinking, and they are today addressing how you compensate the medical world for wellness. They've done like 15 or 20 design thinking projects, and they're now using it to how you compensate for wellness rather than the cost of service, which is how everybody's paid right now. And if you figure out a new way to compensate, which is what they're trying to do, you're going to change medical care in its entirety.
Right. So there's a lot of possibilities for this design thinking to apply across sectors. And Salz, I want to thank you so much for all these ideas and inspiration. I know that our listeners will get a lot from it. So thanks so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you, and thanks for calling.
You're welcome. And thanks to all our listeners for everything you do to make the world a better place.
Thanks for listening to the Social Good Instigators podcast with Kirsten Bullock. If you like what you just heard, we hope you'll check out our prior episodes, and that you'll pass along our web address, socialgoodinstigators.com, to your friends and colleagues in the social good sector.